All right, folks, on to our next topic. This one I am really interested in because we have a couple of great speakers here. So I'd like to welcome Saurav Jha, who is President and CEO of Simnovus, and Shirish Nagaraj, who is SVP of Global R&D for Airspan Networks. And we're going to be talking about sort of the role of neutral host, private networks, and talking about all of the things that go into the challenges, I think, of testing and scaling when it comes to that. So if I could have each of you gentlemen just sort of set the stage for our audience and give just a minute or two of your perspective on this topic. And Saurav, I'd like to start with you if we can, and just think and just give us sort of your top line thoughts about what it's important for people to know as they think about neutral host and testing at this moment in time.
Sure. Thank you, Kelly, for having me here. It's great and pleasure to meet you all and discuss with you. Yeah, so we have been talking about this private networks. It started from 4G. 4G is quite dominant even today, but 5G is picking up, and what is more picking up very rapidly, and there's a growing demand is about the multi-tenant and the neutral host-based private networks. This is very unique from other private networks in the sense that multi-tenant has many unique challenges as well as the requirements in terms of hosting services from different service providers, at the same time also having a secured private network inside that campus or enterprise. So there are many challenges associated with it. I'm sure we will discuss more in detail as we go forward in this conversation. But the basic context is that when we deal with such a complex network setup, we have to make sure that first of all, we all are aware of the end customers' expectations in terms of how do they want to be isolated. Every tenant wants to be isolated. What is the guaranteed data rate that they desire for, and various other aspects of it. So yeah, so excited to be here and discuss more about it.
Okay, Shirish.
Right. Yeah. Thanks, Kelly. Happy to be here. One of the things that we see is, the overlay, and Saurav talked about this, the overlay of public and private networks together. And that's something that neutral host architectures fundamentally provide. And here, as you go towards private networks, being enterprise friendly is kind of really critical, so that, essentially you have easy deployment mechanisms, as easy to install as Wi-Fi and run as Wi-Fi, for instance. And then on top of that, doing all the things that 3GPP based networks provide. So guaranteed latency, improved security, as well as data localization. So for enterprises, the data needs to be local for running a private network. And ensuring, of course, you have seamless coverage and mobility across the entire space that you're covering. So these are sort of a given set of requirements, but then having both the carrier networks as well as a private network running side by side on shared infrastructure is adds some challenges, because you've got the shared infrastructure which is owned by an entity, and the carriers bring their own signal, and then the private network on top of that overlaid. That whole integration is quite challenging. So I'd say that's kind of the critical thing that we got to focus on.
Okay, so how are these taking shape? And Saurav, maybe I start with you on this. So Shirish, you just sort of mentioned, a carrier network, overlaid onto a private network. Are we seeing, are these, multiple tenants on, on a single core? Are they sharing, RF? Is it more like maybe a traditional DAS setup? Are we seeing slices yet? What shape are these things taking at this point?
Should I go first?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, so since we're discussing the unique challenges around it, so I would say that see, it's not only the technical requirement, but it's almost like a legal and contractual necessity that we make sure that all of these tenants are isolated. We also need to ensure that there are no traffic leakages across tenants. And also at the same time ensuring that there is a fair allocation and distribution of resources, radio resources or compute resources across each tenant. and it has to be very neutral. So and fair, so basically it's an orchestration of different equipments coming from different vendors, and then the system integrator's role, or maybe the managed service partner, they have to ensure that it is properly interoperated and integrated in that architecture. And also it is integrated on one side with the external carrier network, and on the other side with the IT infrastructure of that particular enterprise. So there's an end-to-end orchestration of the entire infrastructure, I would say, where there are several players involved, but they have to work in conjunction and in collaboration, I would say.
Okay, so that sets up, I think, some complexity when it comes to in terms of who's responsible for what. You talked a little bit about process and integration. So what does that look like? Who owns these? I mean, obviously for neutral host, we're talking about, maybe an SI or a neutral host provider, maybe somebody like an Airspan potentially, so Saurav, Shirish, what's your perspective on, how these things are taking shape and what that translates to in the field?
Yeah, so I think there's different deployment architectures that can come to bear here. I mean, you mentioned earlier about DAS, for example, and that's a predominant, obviously very neutral host friendly solution. And DAS is essentially you can have carrier signals or base stations feeding DAS, and that the base station piece is driven by the carriers, but the DAS is essentially deployed typically by a third-party operator or a system integrator, and sometimes the venue itself, right? So there's different ownership right there. And then you have a parallel layer of private networks that is sort of layered on top. And in this case, sort of, at least we believe that you want to keep the basebands separate, so that there's a common shared infrastructure, which is the DAS, but then keep the baseband separate so that you don't have this problem of commingling of different network services. And then on the other hand, and by the way, that is evolving towards Open RAN as we see more and more, and that brings its own unique challenges in terms of testing itself. And then the other architecture that's prevalent is the Mochen style architecture, where you have the same infrastructure, but then connecting to two cores, and that could be to multiple carrier cores or a carrier and a private core itself, and that brings another set of challenges as well.
Okay, great. So let's talk about some of the challenges here, because this is getting very complex very quickly. So Saurav, maybe you can walk us through what you see as some of the specific or unique challenges for this sort of neutral host infrastructure approach for private networks.
I already spoke a little bit of it, but just to touch base on that again. So, so the complexity mainly comes from the fact that there are multi-tenants, there are external networks involved, which needs a smooth integration with the private network setup that you're creating, as well as the integration with the IT network of that enterprise. Now, when we talk about the multi-tenant, the issues are not only limited to the fact that we have to isolate them, and then we have to make sure that there are no traffic leakages, but also make sure that at the same time, they are guaranteed bandwidth allocation, the resource allocation, and it should be fairly allocated. And by the way, I know Shirish knows for a fact that, when it comes to the RAN, especially, it becomes more complicated because, the spectrum allocation, and I think he mentioned the baseband, that's a very good idea. Spectrum allocation is very complex. The radio resources allocations and equally distributing and allocating to each tenant is quite complicated and difficult. And having said that, coming from the validation background, I would say that all of these parties who are involved in this process, be it the vendor equipments or the service providers or the managed service partners, they have to incorporate a very strong and robust validation mechanism at every stage, of the deployment, pre-deployment as well as post-deployment. That's what I would say. Yeah.
Okay. Great. So Shirish, we just had Airspan recently closing on its acquisition of Corning's wireless business. So obviously you folks see that there's, demand in this in-building space and neutral host in, in this market. So let's talk a little bit about what you see there as the opportunity. Are people looking for 4G networks? Are they looking for 5G networks? Is it a combination that they want 4G and 5G ready? What I think we're hearing across the board from the industry that we're seeing more interest in private networks. What's the Airspan perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So Airspan, of course, has a long history of engaging in private networks and mobile networks in general. And then with Corning Wireless, which is where I came from, we have a rich legacy of in-building small cells and DAS solutions, starting with Spider Cloud and mobile access and so on. So the merger of the two sort of is really the right framework, if you will, that we can actually expand the market share in a significant way. There's very clearly a need for in-building and private network solutions right now, especially as you go towards 5G. I mean, you don't have the traditional coverage from the macros coming inside of buildings. So we see that as a huge growth opportunity, first of all. So there's a lot of excitement and interest in the community and within, of course, Airspan, that we believe this to be sort of the next push of mobile coverage. In terms of sort of private networks, what we think is, again, we are ideally positioned here with the DAS solutions that we have. We are evolving those towards ORAN. We have sort of relationships with the carrier networks that can provide a signal source, if you will, for those DAS networks, and then layer on top, a private network solution that also connects to the same DAS. Now, there are challenges doing that on DAS with CBRS, for example, and we are working through those issues. But I think the critical part is how do you tie it all together at the management plane, for example. So at the end of the day, the enterprise doesn't want to have to deal with the complexities of a typical telecom or a 3GPP style network deployment. So we truly believe that if you can tie this all together with a very simplified managed service with a management plane, and with offering the right levels of visibility and controllability of the network, that I think is really the key as you go towards managing these hybrid networks of the future.
Okay, great. And Saurav, I'm wondering if you can walk us through, as we see this increased interest in private networks, and I think one of the questions that has lingered is the speed at which this marketplace is picking up, and sort of this question of scale and how you scale private networks, and obviously testing and having repeatable processes and ensuring that those networks are performing the way that they're expected and doing the things that people want them to do is an important part of that process. So, can you talk a little bit about that aspect of the private network and how testing relates to scale and sort of having that, CI/CD/CT pipeline and the relationship there?
Sure. So, as we all know that private networks, when they're deployed, they are heavily dependent on the software-defined networks, and a lot of equipments being used are also software-driven. And there are regular and repeatable, repeated configurations which are needed, upgrades, build upgrades, and etc. So it's, if you go the manual way, it is going to be very time-consuming and also very error-prone. So the best idea is to have a CI/CD/CD pipeline framework, where even your validation solutions are also software centric, and they can be easily integrated into your automation framework, can be put into the CI/CD/CD pipeline, so that they can be like more robust, repeatable, and continuous testing, which is going on starting from the development phase to various cycles of the validation phase, and then going into the pre-deployment and also post-deployment, I would say. Because what happens is that when you have multiple builds coming in, new network services being introduced, let's say new slice added or new security feature added, you need to make sure that there's nothing which is broken, or the functionality is working properly, and also check the capacity and performance at the same time. So this is a continuous process which has to be carried out all across the solution here.
Okay. And Shirish, I'm wondering if maybe I can come to you on this next question, which is, so when I hear people talk about sort of the CI/CD/CT pipeline, I tend to hear it in the context of the carrier networks, not so much necessarily in the context of private networks. But obviously, as we're getting into this discussion, it's those networks are just as dependent, if not more, on having that type of pipeline. But who's responsible for it in a neutral host situation? Is it the SI? Is it, the network vendor? Is it, the company whose IT department is running this? How does that sort of shake out in reality?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. It's an evolving landscape, is what I would say. I mean, there is a CI/CD pipeline that operators are trying to establish, probably a bit more established on the macro side, on the outdoor space. In-building is still evolving there. On the private network side, I think, you know, at the end of the day, you will have an entity responsible for the network, and that could be the SI, that could be the OEM, in fact, that is actually providing a managed service as well. I think that entity has to be responsible for this entire automation and deployment, efficiency. And so there's probably no single answer that fits the bill as yet on that. It all depends on the business model and who's actually in the end responsible for deploying the network.
Okay. Saurav, what are you seeing develop? Because obviously it sounds like there's a lot of potential different answers. How are you seeing it actually play out in terms of who's responsible for what there?
So I would somewhat agree with Shirish, because as I said, it's a collaboration of all the parties involved, and that's the reason why Simnovus is involved with each type of different entities, be it a vendor equipment manufacturer, or a system integrator, because in most of the cases, since it is an enterprise-led deployment, they have to be the managed service partners. And of course, also the operators, the service providers, if they are managing the services. So everyone is responsible. Validation is required at every stage by all the parties, of course, in different ways and different forms and shapes, but that is needed. And just to end it on a lighter note, Simnovus is ready to take that responsibility as a whole. And that's the reason why we started our professional services along with the product selling, so that we can cater to the end-to-end, the validation requirements.
Okay. So we have an audience question about devices. And so the question is, do private networks require different devices from the public network? I'd like to kind of expand that question and ask each of you what devices that you are seeing, because one of the things that I've been aware of as far as the ecosystem goes is, there doesn't always seem to be the same ecosystem of devices in terms of variety, and whether businesses, particularly in the industrial IoT space, can get the devices that they want in order to operate on their private networks. Anybody want to jump on that question of what you're seeing in terms of device ecosystem?
Yeah,
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
No, very, very quickly, maybe. Just I think that's absolutely right. In private networks, especially in mission critical applications, I'll say, manufacturing, warehouses and so on and so forth, even in the healthcare segment, for example, IoT devices are kind of playing a key role, right? And so those have to be fully integrated, you have to have guaranteed latency and so on. But at the same time, there are cases where you've got the integration of, while they are providing a private network, they also want a public network to work. So there's also smartphone use cases as well. For example, with doctors and nurses in a hospital that need to be on a private network, at the same time also access the public network. So those are the kind of some use cases that we are hearing. But primarily, I think in the private network space, it is an IoT-driven, use case, especially where people see the need for, very tight, reliable network for driving private applications, such as in manufacturing and other mission-critical spaces.
Okay, Saurav, what do you see developing on the device side?
I mean, the fact is that, yes, of course, what Shirish said, that, mostly it's IoT driven, because it's mainly, about like big industries or smart factories requiring the private networks. So that's where it starts. But I would love to see when we go to that stage where, even like common people using their smartphones or CPEs, they are using private network in their campuses or homes or, big buildings. Because I said, I would like to see for a good reason, a replacement of the Wi-Fi network that we have, because there are many challenges associated with it. I'm a big, promoter of going to that extent, but let's see. That's the desire.
Okay. All right, gentlemen. Well, this wraps up our time for this session. Thank you both so much for this perspective. I know this was a fast-moving discussion. To our audience, I hope that you really enjoyed it. And we will now be moving into our next panel, which is on Open RAN.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Thank you, Shirish.